To discuss the latest developments surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, renewed US-Iran tensions, and the growing debate over maritime security in the Gulf, we are joined by geopolitical analyst Tatiana Kukhareva from Moscow, who collaborates on international documentary and geopolitical projects. Thank you for joining us. How do you assess the competing US and Iranian positions over security and navigation in the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, that's quite a conflicted question to begin with, right, Fiza? Because obviously the US is nowhere near the Strait of Hormuz. So, you know, that already raises questions in itself over its position or its legitimacy. In the meantime, the problem with American position is that it kind of contradicts itself. On the one hand, we see them saying, that we need a Strait of Hormuz open, absolutely open to every ship and no control over it whatsoever. On the other hand, we see the same America imposing a blockade over the Strait of Hormuz whenever it sees fit. So, yeah, if we strip down to what actions the US is taking, then technically the US position is that the only power that is allowed to control the Strait of Hormuz is actually the US. And in that respect, it kind of makes no sense to a non-American, obviously. In the meantime, the Iranian position that the countries that actually border that strait have to be allowed to control it, it kind of does logically make more sense, right? From a perspective of a person who's looking at the map, to simplify this, that is actually making much more sense. In the meantime, that position obviously is contesting the US hegemony in the region. Which again, from an analytical perspective, coming from as well from a Russian person, I think that we live in a world where the position of the universal policeman has already outlived itself.
All right. What about the recent toll fees that Donald Trump has just announced? And why do you think that the foreign minister of Iran has rejected it? Although they say that, the countries that are securing the maritime region deserves a compensation. What should that compensation be?
Well, I'm afraid that the question of compensation, that's down to Iran to decide what it wants for compensation. Obviously, it's not news that a country that came under attack would demand reparations. We've seen that many times over. In the meantime, when it comes to the tolls, again, it's much more complex than that, because if you actually follow Donald Trump and what he does and does not say, he just contradicts himself so many times throughout the week.
Right.
That it raises more questions than it answers. However, and for Iran, again, if we're talking about a narrative perspective here, then for Iran, anything they agree to, considering the position they've been put in by this conflict, would have to constitute a clear win.
True.
So essentially, they would not agree to something kind of given to them by the US. That would have to be their condition agreed to in Washington.
What impact could renewed maritime tensions have on global energy supplies and international shipping, as per your opinion?
Well, that's an interesting question, because on the one hand, the obvious answer to your question would be that it would again raise, we would see the prices go sky high, and it does raise many tensions on the market. But at the same time, we need to understand that, again, for instance, for Washington, that might not be such a big problem, because first first and foremost, the Washington does not depend on the Strait of Hormuz and the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz as much as other players on the market. It also is the biggest oil. It produces the most oil in the world, especially if we take into account all of the oil that they might explore in Venezuela following the events that unfolded earlier this year. So what then happens on the market when the Strait of Hormuz is blocked? For instance, one of the biggest sufferers is Europe, that depends on supply coming through the Strait of Hormuz. And when that supply does not come to Europe, that essentially pushes Europe to buy more American crude, which we've already seen happen throughout this escalation. So again, there's the global perspective. The global perspective, obviously nobody in the world essentially, in theory, benefits from rising prices, from deficit on the market. However, having said that, the US actually does benefit from the deficit on the European market because it can fill that gap.
All right.
And that essentially, that also, I'm sorry, I'm just to finish my thought, that also kind of caters to the geopolitical interests that the US has, because such economic dependency puts Europe into further geopolitical dependency of the US as well.